Good evening, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this session on the rise and fall of multilateralism hosted by the Colaba Conversation. Before I get into introducing the speakers very briefly, let me thank ORF and my old friend Akshay for inviting me to moderate what I think is a very important panel discussion on the rise of multilateralism. I think we've had so many panel discussions on globalization and the death of globalization, the rebirth of globalization. And I think multilateralism is going, not following a different trajectory. There's going to be conversations around in Colaba and otherwise on the rise of multilateralism and the fall, and perhaps another rise of multilateralism. So I think it's important that we have this conversation because multilateralism has had its heyday, and during its heyday, things were working really well. Global trade increased, global financial flows increased, and then we had a financial crisis. Then the IMF became much more relevant. Then we've had the pandemic, and hopefully the WTO after the pandemic will become much more relevant, and there'll be a platform for discussing trade and capital flows again. But at the moment, we are, as the title seems to suggest, going through a crisis of multilateralism. But I don't think it's going anywhere. It's going to stay, given that the world economy has so many countries with differing views. Unilateralism is very easy to pursue, but it's not in everybody's best interest. And the country that pursues unilateralism also recognizes that indeed it's not in their best interest. Everybody's trying to get a good deal for themselves. And I think we have to reinvent and rethink of multilateralism. And I just want to say one thing before I go to Ambassador Puri, which is that, I mean, we all know about, the ups and downs of institutions, and they go through a cycle. I mean, IMF, the World Bank, the WHO, the UNFCCC, the G20, the WTO, and so many multilateral institutions. They've all had a wonderful run, and they've also had a fall. And I'm sure they will rise again. But one thing that I wanted to say, especially, I come from a university now where we are studying political systems and strategic systems, and there's a new lens through which the university is looking at these systems. And that lens is one of decolonization. Of course, decolonization of knowledge systems has become quite a fascinating subject of research across countries. And I think at the Shiv Nadari University, we are also looking at decolonization of knowledge systems. But I think that this is important because, during the rise of multilateralism, there was no pushback to homogeneous entities from developing economies and from emerging economies. With the rise of China, with the rise of Brazil, with the rise of India, there's been some sort of a pushback on what is the best way multilateralism can be taken forward. And I think that's the right spirit to discuss this, not discarding, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but looking at it through a different lens. Maybe decolonization is not the best way to look at it. Maybe it is a good way to look at it, but we have to reach some sort of a convergence in the views across 150 plus countries. And it's not going to be an easy task. Collective action at the best of times fails if you have 3 or 4 entities, and here you're talking about more than 150 entities, depending on the institution that you're looking at. So this is a crisis, but also in every crisis, as the cliche goes, lies an opportunity. And I'm sure that we're going to have a wonderful conversation around multilateralism, the rise and the fall. And I'm really happy to introduce, I'm meeting her for the first time, but I've heard so much about her. Ambassador Puri, it's a delight to have you here, and over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Rajat. I'm very happy to join this Colaba conversation on a favorite subject, not the way it has been framed. As you can imagine, I'm a committed multilateralist, but the provocative title represents not a singular, but a plural phenomenon. As you rightly said, it's up and down, it rises and falls. And there have been many rises and falls of multilateralism in waves. And like Mark Twain said about himself, reports of multilateralism's demise are exaggerated. So, where are we in terms? What is multilateralism? Very quickly, I would like to define multilateralism, anchored in the UN and the BWI, Bretton Woods institutions, is a global governance and rules of the game universe. And that was established 75 years ago. It had spawned a web of specialized agencies and covers every area of global concern and public good. It is the interaction of the three UNs, we the people, we the Secretariat, and we the member states. It's the power play and dynamics of decision making among the big, emerging, and small powers that determines its success or failure. Whose multilateralism and for whose benefit is often the issue. Then, of course, the highs of multilateralism that you referred to. For 75 years, multilateralism has ebbed and crested on the four projects of humanity, if I may put it that way: peace and security, human rights, sustainable development, and of course, humanitarian action. And in all of this, I think they have risen on the back of global norm setting, standard setting, whether it is a comprehensive body of human rights covenants, Rio and Rio Plus 20 and Agenda 2030, sustainable development covenants and compacts, whether it is Paris Climate Agreement, WSIS, disarmament treaties, and the soft law, a kind of soft law on everything of common concern, global concern. So that has been one of the major contributions of the UN and the multilateral. There has been, of course, advocacy and movement building around each cause, knowledge hub and global best practices, and lighthouse programs in countries, including peacekeeping. 72 operations since 1948 and 13 active missions right now in 3 continents. Relief has been provided to 59 million refugees over time, reducing maternal mortality, ending polio, promoting gender equality, being the voice of developing countries, and the member states using its convening power for any sunrise area like Tech 4.0 and cybersecurity governance. That's the potential. However, the lows of multilateralism include institutional capture by major powers, unrepresentative nature of key decision-making bodies, UN Security Council with the P5, especially China, showing no will for expansion in permanent membership and reform despite major geostrategic changes and needs. IMF World Bank quota reform is slow, largely blocked. The shaping and gaming of the world, monetary, financial, and trading systems by a few, for the few, still continuing in so many ways. So UNSC's conflict prevention, peacemaking, and building role against regional conflicts, asymmetrical wars, and terrorism has been hobbled by elitism, cross veto, or implementation paralysis, being used by major powers as flags of convenience for waging their own wars and peace, and to pick up the pieces when things fall apart. And as T.S. Eliot said, anarchy is used upon the world. Libya, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Mali, Sudan. You look at all these cases. Now, as you mentioned, universal membership of 194 countries makes consensus building elusive, hence the resort to unilateralism by PICBAs, regionalism, proliferation of plurilateral issue-based strategic groupings, G7, G20, BRICS, IPSA, the Quads, and mini-lateralism, as they are calling it. The UN lacks teeth, scale, and ambition, as admitted by UN Secretary General himself, and sovereignty is invoked by the powerful, but the protection of rule-based, equitable, democratic system is seen to be denied to the weak. So these are some of the negatives. And then multilateralism faced the COVID test when the COVID-19 pandemic triggered an unprecedented global health World War III like Armageddon. There was a universal angst about a crisis in and of multilateralism and a trust deficit. Just when the world needed the most, the WHO, the global public health guardian, was seen as having failed in effective health and biosurveillance, early warning on global pandemic, on the origin of the virus, and on driving a global response. IMF, World Bank helped developing countries facing both liquidity crunch and financial and economic crisis by allocating a historic 650 billion of SDRs, but which went mostly to developed countries because of the formula. And World Bank's emergency relief of $160 billion was inadequate. So this, despite recognizing that a global crisis like no other requires a global response like no other. Even before COVID-19, however, UN at 75, the WTO in particular, and the MFIs were in crisis due to, as you talked about globalization, anti-China deglobalization, qua multilateralism sentiment, and the national to global short-term hardship to long-term benefit trade-offs on global public good issues. So under Biden, there has been a return of the prodigal superpower, and post-Brexit Europe too is scrambling to become the catalyst for revitalized multilateralism, sometimes to tame and other times to co-opt China, as we saw through progress in climate multilateralism. Emerging powers like India have tried to influence and reform the institution and rules of the game towards more equity and public good decisions, as have smaller countries, using Lilliputian tactics of bending together to exercise of margin of persuasion with only partial success. So, where do we go in terms of reform? The civilizational come multilateralism crisis is one of the schisms in the body social of the world politics, like US-China one that we are facing, and which cannot be resolved by what Arnold Toynbee called archaism or futurism. At this creative, destructive moment, like 1945, archaic multilateral institutions need recreation to not only build back better, but to build anew through a mandate review, more representative governance, impartiality, technical excellence and independence, strengthening of crisis response capacity, and financial viability and stability. Futurism, that is the ideal projected future conceived self-centeredly by reigning powers, will not work, whether it's America first or Chinese dream. Global human solidarity is the only way. So let us remedy the dominance-based architectural flaw, as well as the three UNs not always working in sync flaw in this rebirth. Let countries be bold and convene a review conference under Article 108, 109 of the UN Charter to design and build a new 21st century UN BWIs on the debris of this mega crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Puri, for those excellent examples of the highs and lows of multilateralism. It is my pleasure now to invite Amar Bhattacharya, an old friend who is currently the chair of UN Independent Task Force on Climate Finance and a senior fellow at Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C. Amar, over to you.
Pleasure to be here as part of the Colaba Conversation. I really want to applaud the tour de force of Ambassador Puri in laying out where we are and where we are not on multilateralism. My own view is that rather than rise and fall of multilateralism, I would describe it as the ebbs and flows of multilateralism. We never really had a perfect system to start with. Representativeness has always been a problem. The Security Council, has been monopolized by the big powers. The international institutions, as Ambassador Puri pointed out, has been monopolized by the big powers. And even the UN, which is the most representative body, has had difficulties. But, I also think we can applaud, a lot of what has been achieved. And I want to focus particularly on perhaps the most difficult challenge the world faces, which is climate change, and the way in which the world is tackling it, because it tells us about the way in which multilateralism is evolving. So if you look at if you look at where we are today compared to where we were even at the time of the Paris Agreement, I would say we have made important strides forward. If you think about it in terms of the level of ambition, the world has taken strides. It took a big stride in Paris. It took a stride in Glasgow. We are not yet there. We are probably still well above 2 degrees. But there were very, very important steps. Listening to the world leaders in Glasgow, I certainly felt that there was a spirit of cooperation. When our Prime Minister spoke in Glasgow, it was going the distance in offering something that India was knew would be difficult for it, but it was in the spirit of cooperation. I think every leader there that I listened to, spoke with conviction and spoke with the realization that the world was facing an existential threat. Second, within the kind of frame of the UN, and it is, as Ambassador Puri pointed out, the universal frame that the world has, there was significant progress made this time round. There was agreement on the ambition itself, recognizing that the world could not wait, setting an annual review process with now clear benchmarks around what that will be, a big step forward. Second, focus on adaptation and vulnerable countries. We still didn't reach agreement on loss and damage, but I would say there was good progress on the adaptation and resilience agenda, and certainly in terms of recognizing what the shortfalls are. I often say recognizing the shortfalls is as important as celebrating the accomplishments. Third, there was very, very good progress, I would say, in the understanding of finance. We have been at loggerheads between the developed and the developing countries on finance for a long time. But I think this time round, there was a lot more discussion on finance that is fit for purpose, finance that will help deliver on the ambition. And again, there was a process agreed upon that will take this forward. Finally, the Paris rule book, which again has been, there for a while and open and not moving forward, reached closure on some important elements, including transparency and Article 6. So I don't consider, when you look at what happened in Glasgow, failure of multilateralism in the official sense. I think it was a good step forward. But the biggest message out of Glasgow is that multilateralism now does not stay just within the halls of the negotiators. It moves visibly and palpably in many other ways. Very, very importantly now, the private sector is very, very engaged in the climate agenda. And you all have heard about this famous 130 trillion commitment. But with that kind of commitment comes scrutiny, which is very valuable. The Secretary General is proposed to set up an independent group to ensure that the private sector commitments are high quality, have the integrity, and that's a good thing. But the private sector is now at the table. The other thing that I thought was extremely moving was the movement on science, technology, and particularly the coalitions around what are called the breakthrough technologies: power, steel, hydrogen, transport, agriculture. So I think the coming together of the world's brains, engineers with common purpose. I participated in the science many days, but I was most impressed on the science day, just to see how the world's scientists are coming together. And they tend to have less of the hang-ups of the negotiators and the government bureaucrats. It was extremely positive again. The last point I want to make is now civil society are holding international agencies, holding global leaders much more to account. Out of the 40,000 people in Glasgow, 20,000 people were representative people. They were not, in international institutions or governments or whatever. People now, as Ambassador Puri pointed out, are very much more engaged. So does that mean we have solved the problem? The answer is no. We will have the ebbs and flows of multilateralism. But watching that process, I felt that there is a lot of progress that has been made and to be made. The last thing I want to say about climate change, and it's an interesting story about multilateralism. For the longest time, we were unable to put climate center stage because the views of the developing world, and I represented the developing world, was that this must be within the confines of the UNFCCC because we felt we had better voice in those institutions. But the result was that we were not getting what we needed, which is a raising of ambition. Now climate figures in every international, it figures in the UN's, in the UN General Assembly and in the every year. It figures in the G7, it figures in the G20, it figures in the work of the international financial institutions. And if you look at the changes that have been made in the last couple of years, look at the way in which the remit of the IMF has changed in terms of climate. Look at the proposal now on the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. Look at the World Bank's Climate Change Action Plan. Look at the joint statement coming from the multilateral development banks at Glasgow. So I feel that actually there is much more possibility right now of pushing for coherence. And I'm very, very glad that the UN Secretary General has been pushing that very actively. So I think we will go through ebbs and flows. There are clearly areas which we have been in stalemate, like the Security Council, for a very long time. But I am particularly hopeful that we will see great progress on the climate agenda, not because climate is some kind of a restriction, but because the transition to a net zero economy for a country like India is the growth opportunity of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Amar. I really like the optimism, both in your content as well as in your voice, the way you speak about climate finance and climate change and the optimism that underlies it. It's really sort of heartening to hear. And one of the things that you said about the ease of people-to-people contact amongst countries, the scientists coming together, and that's something that trade economists over the years have been talking about, that trade could be a route to peace or to avoidance of conflict. And I think if we extend that analogy, that scientists and people coming together could be the route to addressing climate change problems, provided we can get the bureaucratic and political convergence that you talk about, which has been really difficult to attain. But thank you for that really good presentation. It's my pleasure now to introduce another old friend, Heribert Dieter, Senior Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Welcome, Heribert.
Good evening, Rajat, and good evening to everybody else on the panel, as well as those that are following the debate. I, of course, would very much prefer that we meet in Mumbai, and probably the next conversation will take place in person, which would, of course, be progress, real progress, and in improvement. In contrast to the previous two speakers, I'm going to present a more skeptical perception of multilateralism. And I will not talk about climate issues. They are very important. There is progress. Amar has pointed that out very nicely. I look at trade and finance, which are the areas where multilateralism had its strengths in the past, and where we currently see a fundamental weakness of the process. Let me first of all go to address the question why it is so difficult to promote multilateralism these days in the OECD world, but also in emerging societies, emerging markets. it seems that after a longer period of time in which many observers thought that the preferences of societies are relatively identical, not completely identical, but quite similar. We suddenly realize at a range of domains that societies want to be different. The first country to name here is, of course, China, that has a explicit policy of wanting to be different. The expectation of the era of Deng Xiaoping and subsequent leaders of the party that China would become like a Western society, democratic, open, that has been proven wrong. And now we see that China is on a different trajectory, inward-looking, decoupling. It's not the United States that, or not primarily at least, that wants China to decouple. It's China itself that emphasizes decoupling. So this issue of preferences that differ makes it so much more complicated than in the past to construct a meaningful multilateral organization. And where we see that very clearly is in the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is in deep trouble since many years, and I cannot see that anytime soon there will be a solution to the deadlock that we observe in the World Trade Organization. The next ministerial meeting in a few weeks will not change that, and there is very limited, if any, appetite in the United States of America to revitalize the World Trade Organization and its dispute settlement mechanism as long as China is not changing its status in the World Trade Organization. The International Monetary Fund, and you mentioned that, Rajat, in your introduction, had its renaissance 10 years ago. But here again, we see that the International Monetary Fund is not exactly sliding into oblivion, but it's less relevant than it used to be. And let me just point out to one issue where I do see a significant challenge for finance in the coming years, and that is the return of inflation and the diverging monetary policies of major economies. I think we are heading for a bit of a clash in 2022 when many central banks will return to a tighter monetary policy. And there is one major central bank that will not do that in the coming year, and that's the European Central Bank. And we already witness a weakening of the exchange rate of the euro vis-a-vis the dollar. The point here is that we don't have an answer to that issue. We cannot. There is no mechanism to force the Europeans to consider the effects of their monetary policy on the rest of the world. And again, I would expect that there are some concerns in Washington if the dollar and the euro are approaching parity, and there is no answer. We can only pray that there will be some solution, but I can't see it, and it's a clash of trains in slow motion. And finally, where we also see how difficult it is to keep a multilateral organization, if it's a plurilateral one, if you want to call it like that, alive, is the European Union. The European Union is having trouble now. There is serious trouble with the Eastern European member countries of the European Union. And again, there was the expectation that the European integration process is good for everybody, and I'm sure that, it is on balance a positive project. But we do see that they are divergent perspectives, and that makes it difficult to move forward in the European integration process. A final word on what could be done and why I don't think it is the picture, although I sounded skeptical, and I am skeptical regarding the existing multilateral organizations, in particular the World Trade Organization. We looking to those days when the world was split in a Soviet part and a Western part. The trade regime was never a comprehensive one that covered the entire world. We had, you could call the General Agreement on Tariffs to Trade a club of like-minded countries, and I think this is the future for the organization of international trade, not bilateral or minilateral free trade agreements. These are too costly. They do not reduce trade costs sufficiently, but we shall have something like clubs of like-minded countries, and I think we need more discussion on that. I don't think it is a perfect solution. Of course, the perfect solution for a political scientist, but also for a trade economist, is the multilateral trading system. But given that we are living in an age of geopolitical conflict, we have to look for second best solutions, and a second best solution would be a comprehensive, deep trade agreement that comprises large economies without a big state-owned sector of the economy, and you know what I mean with that. So I think this is the future, and we may see relatively soon developments in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Heribert. I mean, your skepticism does have some basis. I think, as one can see, the glass is half full or half empty, but certainly your skepticism has basis. One of the things that struck me about what you said is the divergence of preferences and the difficulty of aggregating those preferences into a common sort of social welfare function, if you will, if I follow the terminology used by Arrow, and the difficulty in going from individual preferences to a sort of a social welfare function that is acceptable to everybody. And that, of course, as you know, is called the Arrow's impossibility result. And I hope it is not in the case of multilateralism. I hope it is not an impossible result. But certainly, divergent preferences being aggregated is a hard task. It's my pleasure now to introduce to you the final speaker of this panel. Last, but as the cliche goes, certainly not the least. We started with Ambassador Puri, and we're going to conclude with Erin. Erin is the Special Advisor G20 Women Summit in Australia. Erin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rajat, and thank you to all of the wonderful interventions that we've already had here. I feel like I've got a lot to build upon, but I think I'm going to go in a slightly different direction as well with my with the remarks that I've got to make today. Before I do start, though, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which I'm zooming into you from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Australia. At any event, we acknowledge the traditional owners. And one thing I want to point to here is the relevance of learning from our Indigenous elders in overcoming some of these challenges that we've been talking about today, in particular climate change. And it's certainly really relevant conversation in Australia right now. So I come to this topic of multilateralism from the perspective of Australia. We are a middle power country down here who really depends on a multilateral system that functions properly. We are a fan of the minilaterals at the moment as well. Conversations around AUKUS, around the Quad, very popular in Australia at the moment. So, but just going back to your premise, Rajat, around the fall of multilateralism. What I'm going to talk about is I guess, comes from the G20 system. And that's a system that I say wouldn't necessarily has fallen, but is perhaps a little bit lost. And so maybe multilateralism, maybe that's an indicator about multilateralism being lost more generally as well. I come into contact with many multilaterals in my work. So, ASEAN, APEC, Mercosur, the UN, others. But I will drill down into the G20 where I've got some observations that I can make from the last sort of 6 years that I've been involved in the various engagement groups. And you've already talked about this today, and that is the point around the increase in civil society, or the increase in the range of voices that are contributing to multilateralism. And I think that's an interesting frame of which to look at the G20 as well, which has these structures in place, these mechanisms in place for engagement groups. So you mentioned that I'm a special advisor to the W20, but have been to the Youth 20, the Y20, the B20. There are all of these different engagement groups that address many of those areas that have been mentioned. So I think they call it the alphabet soup, right, of engagement groups, the B20, the Business 20, the U20, the Urban 20, and so on and so forth. And they all sort of address these different areas. I say that really loosely because each year they chop and change, and each country and presidency wants to give its own flavour to the G20 and what it actually gets at. But you know what these provide is that, so you've got your track one, and these do provide a very formal route in. Now, today I was looking at a report from 2015, which was the first G20 that I had attended. And we had congratulated the Labor Ministers meeting on endorsing this reduction in youth unemployment by 50% over the next 10 years, and were urging leaders to take forward that recommendation as well. And what struck me about it was that in 2015, that kind of hard targets and commitments were made coming out of the civil engagement through to the track one engagement of the G20. And that's changed significantly, I think, in my observations over the last few years. So that's probably the more pessimistic perspective, that, you know, the optimist sort of, you know, talks about, you know, this being a good thing. You've got this whole new range of voices that can engage in international policy making, potentially, despite the fact that none of it is legally binding anyway, and it's a set of recommendations that perhaps some member states will take forward. But, you know, and but I guess, again, the pessimistic side of it is there's no way to measure any of this. No one really is measuring and holding to account. You might have policy recommendations that are re-endorsed year after year, but this has all been quite watered down. So let me talk about that a little bit more, in a little bit more detail. So you have these groups I mentioned, business, urban, science, and so on, all really important areas. And you talked about them being a potential pathway to peace. Well, perhaps they are. It's better to have them than not have them. But the range of issues you're dealing with in the G20, which was primarily an organisation to set up to deal with the global financial crisis, or was elevated to a leaders' meeting to deal with the economy, is now dealing with everything from, and this isn't a bad thing, domestic violence, global tax, labour markets, entrepreneurship, a whole range of civil and social issues, which, again, aren't bad for the G20 to deal with, but if you're not actually achieving the outcomes that you set out to do, why is it broadening in scope? And what I call a mandate creep within that particular institution. And this all comes down to how they're funded, how they're structured, which member states, what are the other priorities that they've got right now. Something like the G20 was hugely, I think, overshadowed by COP26. Again, is that a bad thing? I'm not sure. It's good that it happened in the first place. So does this mean that multilateralism is dead, or is it, you know, it's lost more than anything? We know that, and this has already been mentioned, that member states will use these multilateral institutions to pursue their own objectives. But we do know that they are a platform for states to engage, for dialogue, and it is better to have some dialogue than not have a dialogue at all. We do need forums where we can deal with climate change, pandemics, and so on, where leaders, where senior officials will get to run into each other in the hall, but where you have also that opportunity for civil engagement, so long as it's, you know, the key things I say here are, it takes resources. And it takes political will, but it also takes a significant amount of focus in terms of what that multilateral institution is trying to achieve, or you end up where something like the G20 is today, which is relatively diluted organization where we don't see, I want to give you one more example, just because, and Lakshmi, you might find this interesting as well. In 2020 in the G20, it took until April for gender to be mentioned once on a G20 document. So it is important that these in groups are there to hold the governments to account, but they are lost. So I'll leave that there so we can hopefully go to some dialogue, Rajat, but thank you for having me here today.
For that really good, wonderful presentation. And I think in some sense mirroring what Heribert had said about divergence preferences, you talked about it through the multiple voices that have emerged within the G20, including civil society, business, youth, labor, an increasing voice coming in to the multilateral system, making it difficult for not only agendas to sustain, as you said, but also to arrive at convergence. And the fact that these institutions don't have teeth makes it difficult for agendas to actually be achieved. Even organizations that have potentially had teeth are undermined, as Heribert mentioned. They have been undermined as well. So wonderful. Thank you, Erin. Would any of you like to make a remark, Ambassador Puri, Heribert, Amar, based on what you have said in the panel discussion? Would you like to revisit based on what you've heard from other panelists? Ambassador Puri, I will sort of go to you first.
It has been wonderful listening to the other panelists, and I think I would agree with most of what has been said. Just a few points I would like to pick up. I think climate multilateralism is now the flavor of the season, if I may put it that way. And, it is being seen as a way to revive multilateralism, as a way to give new heft to what I would say is a sagging, agenda, international agenda. And, what you what was referred as the divergent preferences is also about what I said about who's going to take the most pain and short-term pain for long-term gain, and whose long-term gain. So all these, all these elements come into the calculus of multilateral deals. So I think I would agree that we have made progress in Glasgow, and it's at least not going back on anything. If anything, we are going forward. And this climate multilateralism, however, should not turn to, for example, there is it was mentioned that WTO is in paralysis, and the ministerial, I agree that there are concerns that the ministerial may not yield much, but there are also moves there to bring in, by the European Union, for example, to bring in a subject of trade and climate change for negotiations, for example. And also European Union is talking about the carbon tax, border taxes. So these are elements that are again going to create issues for developing countries like India, though they may be addressing or actually targeting more competitive countries like China. So this is something that we need to see whose multilateralism and for whom. Right. The other aspect, if I may quickly refer to G20, I think G20 is a plurilateral body, and you rightly said, and I'm sad to hear that gender had such difficulty in being mentioned in the summit, because I was at the birth of W20 in Ankara. UN Women, at that time I was with UN Women, and I really work very hard to bring that group to life. So absolutely important, accountability, monitoring, and monitoring progress. And this is something we have said right from the beginning. And also the voices that we have, these groupings that we have created, the voice participation has to be real, and it should be incorporated in the leaders' outcomes. That is something that is very important if G20 has to really gain wider support and traction.
Thank you, Ambassador Puri. Before I come to you, Haribert, let me sort of go to Amar in the order that we spoke. Amar, India has, speaking from the context of India and climate, India has been constantly sort of being pushed, if you will, to up its ambition on climate targets. And this time, Prime Minister Modi did lay out an agenda for India to achieve net zero by 2070. So India has, in a sense, upped its ambition to try and help the world achieve that net zero emission targets. But for its part, India has been requesting for several years now that the developed countries sort of fulfill their commitments on technology transfer and financial commitments. So is there hope, Amar? Do you see hope in that happening now that India has met its side of, if you will, the bargain?
Yeah, so I think let me frame it against the, what has been a theme here, multilateralism for what? And, coming from the developing world, I would say that we have to recognize that the next 3 decades will be a very crucial period for development, and a development that in some sense protects the sustainability of the planet. And the latter is just as important for us in the developing world as it is for anybody else, because we will be disproportionately affected by climate change. So in that context, on the development side, we not only have the 2030 agenda, development agenda, but we have to recognize that in the coming 3 decades, the world will add 2 billion people to the population of the world, all in the developing world. And the way in which we invest in that will matter for those countries and will matter for the future of the world. So the development challenge is very closely linked with the climate challenge. They are not separate. The investments that we make for development are the same investments we should be making for sustainable climate. The scale of those investments are just huge. That's where multilateralism comes in exactly in the way that you mentioned. So in that context, in terms of the scale of investments, the 100 billion is okay, but as we pointed out in our report, was not delivered on and will certainly not be enough. The Prime Minister mentioned $1 trillion at Glasgow, and he's indeed correct. That's the scale of finance we are looking for, okay? But it's an investment, it's not a cost. It's what we are investing for the future of the people and the planet, and it will pay for itself. So we need the finance, though, here and now. And the reality is the international financial institutions, as Ambassador Puri pointed out, have not been able to provide financing at that scale. At Glasgow, Nick Stern and I put out a paper on how this financing can be mobilized, and we got good traction. We got good traction from the US, from the UK, from Germany, and we got good traction from the developing countries, from India, from China, Indonesia, South Africa. So we do believe there is a path forward that is a win-win path, because ultimately these investments are opportunities for the aging North. They can earn a higher rate of return given that the marginal productivity of capital will be higher in the South. So at this moment, we have to open people's eyes from the narrow perspectives of the G7 to now saying there's actually a cooperative opportunity here that will give development and that will give climate. So I end therefore still on an optimistic note, but with a big challenge for us. And in the coming year will be a very crucial period. Why? Germany is in the presidency of the G7. They can lead on this agenda. They are proposing to push for a climate club. We are saying a climate club must also be a development club. The G20 will be led by Indonesia. I think after, what was not a very, let's say, productive G20, we have an opportunity again to make this G20 about investment and innovation. India will succeed Indonesia. So, in all of this, I think the UN plays the authorizing environment. The ECOSOC is focusing on this agenda this year in a big way. So I hope that, we will get some positive and constructive momentum. The area that will remain most difficult, so I'm much more optimistic on finance. I'm not so optimistic on trade because, we are, as you know, caught in an institution that has great difficulties. But, my friend and colleague, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, if anyone can help maybe steer us through that.
Thank you, Amar. I will now go to Heribert. He wanted to make a couple of points. Heribert, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Rajat. As much as I would like to agree with everything that Amar has said, I'm a little bit more concerned when it comes to the political dimension of implementing all the entire agenda to fight climate change. What I observe is that and I perhaps I'm too critical of the political developments in Europe and in my country, in Germany in particular. But I do observe a certain disconnect between what people do and what people consider to be good. There is not much change in the lives of people. Just spend a Friday afternoon on a German highway. You don't see that they have altered their way of life. And I do also see that there is a certain risk in this process, because young people who have been, should I say, led by Greta, to believe that immediate action is not only necessary but also possible, they might come out of that process damaged, because their political processes tend to be slower than activists want them to be, and that is a certain risk that could contribute to a difficult situation for those energetic young people. Let me say a final word. We are running out of time on the G20. And I do acknowledge, of course, Erin's concern about the insufficient recognition of the issues that she has been advocating. But when I look at the broader process, what we have seen in Rome a few weeks ago is that two big players haven't been there. Putin hasn't been there. Xi Jinping hasn't been there. Probably Putin didn't want to be shirt-fronted again or criticized for quite a number of activities. But it reflects that it is much easier to have a normative vision and to say what is necessary than to get actual support in political processes. And that is a bit of a concern that I would like to raise at the end of this input. Thank you.
Erin, last word perhaps from you. If you could also say something about, you mentioned that the G20, as an engagement platform, doesn't add as much value, even though it's been elevated to the leaders' level. There is an engagement platform. Leaders meet. Heribert just mentioned that two, big leaders of the world were not present in this G20. But as an engagement fora, where leaders of 20 major countries of the world or regions of the world meet, is that not of some value? They exchange views, they talk to each other, they carry back home information, issues that feedbacks into the local communities, into the domestic environment. Is that not of value, you think?
No, I do agree. It is a value, and the more of that is a good thing. As I mentioned, the more of those water cooler conversations, the better. where perhaps the engagement with the broader audience isn't there for leaders in particular, and setting aside the issue that 2 leaders didn't turn up. And that's a challenge for the G20 now. Where is the G20 going to fall in terms of list of leaders' priorities? But the actual civil society groups back in the day used to always have an audience with G20 leaders. That no longer happens. So this connection between the two, well, there's actually 3 tracks, but this third engagement group track it's not disappeared. That's unfair, but it's no longer there in the same way that it used to be. And just to go back, Ambassador Puri, I do want to say that we mentioned this and we lobbied from the W20 to the terrific Dr. Thoroya Obaid in Saudi, who did work tirelessly to get gender up into the G20. So I do have to give her credit where credit is due. That wasn't her. She did a terrific job. But, I guess an observation here about not just the G20, but multilateral institutions more broadly, is their ability to adapt and change. So when the G20 was elevated to a leaders' meeting to deal with the global financial crisis and was relatively successful at the time, what we ended up with was an organisation that's actually quite agile and has capability to adapt year on year because it doesn't have a secretariat, it has a troika system, it's quite agile. And so I guess the success of a multilateral institution is, can it move and change depending on what the challenge is? So the pandemic, and I would say that the G20 largely failed when it came to COVID-19 and addressing COVID-19. Can the G20, work on the next flavour of the month, which is climate change? It does in elements of the G20, but that's the next big challenge that we're facing. If the organisation can't shift and change, then, maybe it doesn't have value in that way. But, so that's the other thing I'd say. One final comment that I do want to touch on, I've written down a note here. You mentioned the presidency going to Indonesia, then it's India, and India joins the Troika next year, and I know that India is working very hard already behind the scenes with the Sherpa's office in terms of what the agenda for 2023, which is really terrific and promising. Then it goes to Brazil. And so we've got 3 years in the Global South. The G20 is incredibly relevant to the Indo-Pacific now. I think there's 12 Indo-Pacific countries, depending on how you define it. And this is where the economic weight is going to be, and its focus is going to be in this region. So this is a real opportunity to really make some interesting changes and address some of these challenges in the region and in developing and emerging economies. That's all I've got to say. Sorry, I talked probably a little bit too long then.
Thank you, Erin. That was a fascinating argument, I think. And that's a good segue for me to sort of wrap this up. I have no intention of summarizing what all the speakers have said. So thank you, Ambassador Puri. Thank you, Heribert, Amar, and Erin. Let me just make 2 comments. One, sort of leading off from where Erin left off, is the 3 years of presidency in the Global South, Indonesia, India, and then Brazil. And I think one of the reasons for multilateralism to sort of run aground is that not only has agenda changed, but I think it's the rise of the Global South no longer willing to I guess, take the agenda passively that has been set elsewhere. So I think they want to get involved in setting of the agenda. And I think that's one of the reasons why multilateralism is in crisis. I think we will emerge from this, and there will be a new multilateralism in place. And the second point, I think, which is relevance, is that maybe it's sort of to take small baby steps, well, not small, but if you take an analogy from trade, if we're going to have regional agreements that are big enough, that encompass regions of the world, let's say, think about the TTP or the CTTIP without the United States and RCEP. And if you're thinking of multilateral achievements, maybe it's better that these 2 big regions, I'm being naive, I know, and I'm being sort of optimistic, but I'm putting a framework on the table, which is these 2 regions can then sort of talk to one another. And I'm borrowing from what Professor Bhagwati had said many years ago, our regional blocks stumbling blocks, our regional blocks building blocks. And I'm sort of looking at these in terms of building blocks. Regions can talk to one another, of course, representing countries, and that representation, as we know, may not be perfect, but it's easier to get consensus amongst the few than amongst the large. So maybe we get these big groupings together that can negotiate better than separate 190 separate countries. Just a thought, but I think multilateralism will both be a stumbling block. Regional blocks will both be a stumbling as well as a building block to multilateralism. But as Amar said, I think I live in optimism, and I hope all of you also live in optimism. Thank you all. It's been a wonderful, fascinating discussion. Back to you, Akshay, and Janvi at ORF.